Sometime around 11:30 on Sunday night, August 27th, 1922, 3 gunshots echoed through the wooded hillsides of the Sacandaga Valley in upstate New York. 3 gunshots fired into the darkness at Foxlair, Natasha Rambova's stepfather Richard Hudnut's estate. I read from Affairs Valentino, page 140, and I quote, "The thunderstorms rolled by, and lightning cracked late into the night. They were the kind of late summer rain showers that only made the air stickier, and they did little to cool the 3 poker players seated around the table in the front room of Foxlair's big house. Between downpours, the evening silence was broken only by the sound of the 3 friends' laughter, rain dripping from the eaves, and the deep croaks of a few bullfrogs down by the trout pond. Richard Hudnut, Uncle Dickie, had gone into New York for a few days. Mother Muzzy was already tucked in her bed, and Rudy, Natasha, and Douglas Gerrard, Jerry, were absorbed in another round of penny ante. As the cards were being shuffled for another hand, Natasha caught the slight movement of the screen door and spotted the shadow of a man standing on the veranda. Continuing to sort through her cards, she whispered, "Someone's out there. There's a gun in Uncle Dickie's dresser drawer, Jerry. Go and get it." Jerry stood and made the announcement, "My turn to get the drinks," and then he quickly disappeared. Rudy and Natasha continued their cover by chatting about the cards they'd just been dealt. Upstairs, Jerry retrieved a pistol from Uncle Dickie's dresser drawer. Instead of returning to his friends in the front room, he headed down a flight of stairs towards the rear of the residence. He exited through a back door and eased his way around the side of the house and across the dark veranda. With the pistol drawn, he stood on the slick flagstone and yelled at the shadowy figure lurking behind the screen door, "Damn you, hold up your hands, or I'll shoot." The startled man turned and lunged at Jerry. The 2 men struggled for a few moments before the intruder managed to heave Jerry off the veranda and onto the ground some 12 feet below. After slipping in the mud, Jerry regained his footing just in time to fire 3 rapid shots in the general direction of the fleeing prowler. He hit his mark. End quote. By the time Douglas Gerrard, Jerry, shot that spy, he'd known Rudolph Valentino for just over 4 years. And by 1922, Jerry was Rudolph Valentino's loyal friend, mentor, sponsor, and acting manager, as well as being a highly respected and influential Hollywood director and actor. The Irishman commanded an impressive social status among Hollywood's elite, and was known affectionately as the Admirable Jerry. Why was there a spy in the woods, a suited prowler who the Admirable Jerry would shoot when he found him peering through the windows at Foxlair? Well, by August 27, 1922, Rudolph Valentino was, as one headline of the day described him, very, very unhappy, because his employer, Famous Players Lasky Corporation, muscled their way into his personal life and ordered him to stay as far away as possible from his love, Natasha. This order, received as a barbaric intrusion by Rudy and Natasha, was officially handed down by the studio and the Los Angeles district attorney after the Valentinos' Mexican marriage the previous May was declared illegal. Natasha was exiled from Hollywood to avoid any further bad publicity. Their Mexican marriage was annulled. Valentino narrowly avoided a 15-year prison term for bigamy, and they were ordered to wait 1 year before they could cohabit or remarry. Valentino vowed never to work another day for a studio who would wield such control over his personal life, and in the summer of 1922 he defied his overbearing employers and took to the woods with Douglas Gerrard to spend some time with Natasha. The studio responded by dispatching a detective to spy on their top box office star, who had just notified them he was breaking his contract and going on strike. At the time, Douglas Gerrard was also employed by Famous Players Lasky. So how did he come to find himself confronting a prowler on that rain-soaked veranda on the night of August 27th? and fire that automatic pistol not once, but 3 times. And what happened to him as a result of his shooting his employer's detective? Did this incident and his accompanying the mutinous superstar Rudolph Valentino on his great escape compromise Gerrard's position of prestige in Hollywood society and end his working relationship with famous players Lasky? Would the fallout from those 3 gunshots instigate his catastrophic fall from grace? And just who was Douglas Gerrard? Today we answer those questions and more. And I'm very pleased to announce we will be doing so with the authoritative assistance of Douglas Gerrard's biographer, Liam Muldowney. Liam lives in Dublin, where Gerrard was born, and there he collaborates with his co-author and co-researcher, Stephen O'Crowley. Today we welcome the esteemed Douglas Gerrard scholar, Liam Muldowney, who will join us from Dublin to tell us all about Valentino's extraordinary friend. In this episode, we title Rudolph Valentino, the Admirable Douglas Gerrard, and special guest.
Ciao, I am Renato Floris, the very proud publisher of all the scholarly and entertaining books on Rudolph Valentino and Natasha Rambova by Evelyn Zumaya. I'm here today with Evelyn and our special guest, Liam Muldowney, who will be joining us to discuss more about this fascinating person, Douglas Gerrard. Ciao, Evelyn.
Ciao, Renato. And it's great to be here. I'm so excited to share this episode, and I have to say, while working with Liam, I learned a great deal about the fabulous Douglas Gerrard, or Jerry, as he was called by his friends.
So, it's time to introduce Liam. Welcome, Liam.
Hello, Evelyn, and ciao, Renato. Good to be here. Many thanks for your welcome. I am absolutely delighted for the invitation to contribute to this episode of this amazing figure, and I appreciate the chance to do so. Your work and research on Rudolph Valentino is nothing short of amazing.
Hello, Liam, and thank you for that great compliment. Very much appreciated. And I want first of all to thank you for your incredible contribution to this episode, and for sharing your research and making your impressive archive of articles available to me. Before we turn to the discussion of Douglas Gerrard, can you tell us something about yourself and your work?
Well, from an early age, I was always interested in early silent comedy, particularly Laurel and Hardy, Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, etc. I founded the Irish Laurel and Hardy Society over 20 years ago, and we're still going strong today, thankfully. Now, as an offshoot of that, myself and others in the society are involved in the annual Charlie Chaplin Film Festival, which is held in the southern part of Ireland every year. And we host a Laurel and Hardy museum, and we give talks on Laurel and Hardy and also on Irish-born actors in early Hollywood. Now, I began researching the visits to Ireland by Laurel and Hardy some time ago. They were here on 2 occasions during the 1950s as part of a theatrical tour. I ended up publishing a book with that research called Near Dublin in 2019. And then a number of years ago, myself and my colleague Stephen O'Crowley set up Slapstick Ireland to showcase early silent comedy, particularly Irish-born actors who appeared in so many of those early films as bit players and supporting actors. And as we began researching these people, we were amazed at what we found. Some were regulars alongside Charlie Chaplin and Harold Lloyd. People like Paddy Maguire and James T. Kelly, who were born in Ireland, pop up in so many of those Chaplin and Lloyd short subjects. Another lady, Kate Price, born in County Cork, she had her own series of films with Oliver Hardy years before he teamed up with Stan Laurel, so she was in fact Oliver Hardy's first on-screen partner. And she also starred in her own series of movies. Buster Keaton himself admired her, and he was enamoured with her sense of humour, and he loved being around her. At one point, she was the go-to lady in Hollywood if you needed an Irish actress who was like a stern, no-nonsense, mammy Irish character. And then, of course, there's Douglas Gerrard. He worked with some of the biggest names in theatre history before making his way to Hollywood and very quickly establishing himself as a major force in early movie history, both before the camera and behind the camera, and, of course, the after-hours circuit. Now, after some time, Stephen and myself knew we were onto something special, and we felt we had to tell their stories. Most of these guys are unknown today, and we made up our minds that we wanted to change all that, and we wanted to do them justice by bringing them back to life somewhat, in print. Our efforts are due for publication in early 2021, and we hope will be a book called Shillelagh Slapstick.
It is quite remarkable how much you have discovered in your years of impeccable research on these Irish stars, especially on Douglas Gerrard. I begin by asking if you could enlighten us on Doug Gerrard's background, his genealogical history. I know this is something you and your co-researcher, Stephen O'Crowley, have done a great deal of research into. And you also discovered he had a friendship with James Joyce.
Yes, James Joyce. We'll come to him in a moment. That was a fascinating find, all right. But let's concentrate on Douglas's genealogy. He was born Thomas Gerrard Joseph Mary MacMurrough Kavanagh and was the eldest of 8 children. One of his brothers, actually, Charles K. Gerrard, as he was known, can be seen in many movies of early Hollywood, starting with the likes of Douglas Fairbanks, amongst others. He's actually quite famous for playing Lord Plumtree in Laurel and Hardy's short Another Fine Mess. Their father, Charles Sr., was extremely keen to pass on to his children their regal lineage. They were descended from one of Ireland's most famous kings of old, Dermot MacMurrough. Now, Dermot MacMurrough ruled the province of Leinster in the late 1100s. His kingdom covered the counties of Wicklow, Wexford and Carlow at a time when various Irish chieftains only had their own interests at heart. King Dermot was dethroned, and he plotted to seek vengeance on his main rival, Rory, and claim his throne back. Now, what followed would have implications for the island of Ireland for the next 800 years, as Dermot invited King Henry II of England and his Norman army to aid him in his quest. This action was to garner Dermot the name of the most notorious traitor in Ireland, as the subsequent invasion not only established Dermot upon his throne, but also led to Henry becoming Lord of Ireland and marked the beginning of those 8 centuries of English dominance. Now, Dermot had a large number of children, and the common practice amongst large noble families was to foster children to other families living close by. This practice not only eased the numbers at home, but it also strengthened ties between allies, whilst acting as an educational resource as well, allowing foster children to learn the skills of the house they were brought up in. Now, one of Dermot's sons, Donal, was fostered by a family who were said to be descended from Saint Quavon, and he became known as Donal MacMurrough Quavanagh. Donal and his descendants succeeded to the throne of Leinster, and as English became the primary language of the island, the name Kavanagh, a direct phonetic translation of Quavanagh, became the norm. So the name MacMurrough Kavanagh has seen many variations, and eventually the MacMurrough part was dropped as the years went by. It still exists today by those Kavanaghs who simply like the grandeur and belonging to a family of Irish kings. So hence the reasoning behind the Kavanagh brothers, Douglas and Charles Gerrard, using the name at certain time. Charles, for example, when he arrived at Ellis Island, he hoped the immigration clerk would tick the right box and allow a 23-year-old student into the New York madness, and he decided to drop his royal ancestral line by declaring himself Charles MacMurrough Kavanagh. Now, it's more likely than not it made no difference to the clerk in question, but who knows?
Well, with such an auspicious and historically fascinating family tree, with this royal heritage, the Kavanagh brothers no doubt enjoyed considerable social status. And I think one result of this would be Douglas's friendship with James Joyce.
James Joyce, yes. Now, Douglas and Joyce both attended Trinity College, and although they were a few years apart, they met through the various dramatic societies and Shakespearean clubs, finding they shared a common interest in those. Joyce was well known to base the characters in his books on friends and acquaintances, and the fact that he actually names Douglas's father Charles in his most famous work Ulysses is an honour in itself, and I quote, "Charlie Kavanagh used to come out on his high horse, cocked hat, puffed, powdered and shaved," unquote. Now, the two remained quite close, with Douglas supporting Joyce in his venture to open Ireland's first cinema, which he did in 1909. We know that Douglas was on the ground in Dublin at that time, offering guidance and support to Joyce in the venture, which ultimately failed for Joyce, but not by his own doing. And Douglas travelled to Trieste to stay with his friend and again support and guide him as Joyce planned his series of famous Shakespearean lectures that he gave in the city in 1912. And if I might just add here as a side note perhaps, the name Leopold, the very uncommon name Leopold. Leopold Bloom was of course the central character in Joyce's work Ulysses, and he's said to be based on a number of people, but nobody knows for sure. Many names have been mentioned, George Holbrook Jackson, Alfred Hunter for example, but nobody has ever mentioned Douglas Gerrard, Joyce's close friend. Leopold Bloom has Douglas Gerrard written all over him. Leopold Bloom was slightly taller than average. He had a bit of wealth. He lives in an exalted dwelling place. He has sharp wit and is a snazzy dresser who likes fine clothes and is always dressed impeccably. This is Douglas Gerrard. Leopold Bloom had a child who died in infancy. Now Douglas Gerrard had two brothers who died in infancy, and this distressed the family for years. But here you have the biggest coincidence. One of those brothers was named Leopold. Now, it's my opinion Leopold Bloom is based, at least partially, on Douglas Gerrard.
You mentioned Gerrard's interest in the theatre, Liam, even while attending Trinity College. I was impressed to learn about Douglas Gerrard's quite early and notable success in the theatre, this on stages in England and Ireland, Germany, and even Australia, and all before he ever went to America. Can you elaborate on some of his early theatrical success?
Yes, indeed. Douglas spent 5 years with various companies playing in different parts and progressing through the stages of the UK, Ireland and Germany. Now, he very quickly established himself as an extremely able actor, but this was not by coincidence, but by very careful planning on his part. Douglas could be at the top of the bill with one particular company, but then suddenly he would leave and join another, falling right down the pecking order to the bit players as supporting actor roles. And this he did in order to work with some of the biggest names in theatre to gain both their experience and their contact. He was directed by Lewis Waller and William Mollison, two huge names in theatre. He joined Herbert Beerbohm Tree's company, which was a super career move, as Mr. Beerbohm Tree was possibly the world's foremost name in Shakespearean theatre and expected nothing but the best from his actors. Now, it was from one of these contacts, William Mollison, that Douglas's Australian experience came about. Mollison was scouting talent for J.C. Williamson, who was Australia's foremost theatrical man at that time. Now, to get the nod from Mollison was special, and Williamson jumped at the chance to engage someone with Douglas Gerrard's resume and experience. And Douglas himself was only too delighted to have the chance at being the primary name in Australian theatre.
You have a substantial archive of news clippings about Gerrard's theatrical experience in Australia, which you so generously shared with me. And I want to cite two of your articles, which I found particularly interesting. This first notice of Douglas Gerrard's arrival down under. And I cite the Otago, New Zealand Witness from September 27th, 1905, and I quote, "Mr. Douglas Gerrard arrived in Melbourne last week by the Ormuz, on his way to join Miss Tittle Brune's company for the forthcoming Sydney season. He claims Ireland as his home, having been born in Dublin some 30-odd years ago, and all his life he had a desire for an actor's life. The chance came about 15 years ago, and it was not long before his work attracted the attention of Mr. Beerbohm Tree, who was always on the lookout for talent. He played several important parts for 10 years, both at Her Majesty's, London, and in the English provinces, with Mr. Tree's touring companies, his last part being that of Kara, the samurai prince in The Darling of the Gods. Since then he has starred as Lancelot in Merely Marianne, the character in which he will make his Australian debut next month. Personally, Douglas Gerrard is brisk in conversation, vigorous in appearance, and has all the Celt's bounding vitality, combined with a genuine enthusiasm for his profession, all qualities that mark him as a decided acquisition to the Australian stage." End quote. And then this mention from the New Zealand Mail on November 15th, 1905, and I quote, A crowded audience assembled at Her Majesty's Theatre, Sydney, on the 28th October to witness the first production in Australia of Zangwill's clever and charming comedy, Merely Marianne, and to welcome the first appearance of the new juvenile leading man, Mr. Douglas Gerrard. From the very first, the success of the new piece was assured. The sparkling dialogue, convincing situations, and strong human interest attaching to the piece appealing at once to all classes among the audience, while Miss Tittel Brune as the heroine had never been seen to such great advantage. Mr. Gerrard, in the important part of Lancelot, showed dramatic ability and an attractive stage presence." End quote. Despite such glowing press, Douglas Gerrard left Australia after only about 1 year. Am I correct, Liam?
Per Douglas, yes, he didn't last even a year in Australia. And to understand why, we'll go back to the beginning of his Australian experience. Now, due to his resume and experience, J.C. Williamson wanted to make sure that Australian audiences knew they were getting a huge star. So even before Douglas Gerrard had set foot down under, Mr. Williamson filled the Australian daily newspapers with news of this superstar who was coming to perform especially for the Australian people. So by the time he arrived, his name was so well known that he disembarked the ship to almost superstar status. Then as he settled down to work, the reviews came in and they were very, very good. But they were not just assigned to his acting. He found himself regarded as the beauty actor, the charming and dashing Douglas Gerrard. Gossip columns carried his name to overwhelming proportions. His every move was detailed and even his clothes were scrutinised, down to the silk embroidery on his socks. He was even said to be setting the girls' hearts aflame. Now couple that with the fact that he was invited to almost every party, dinner and event, and you can see where this is going. I believe his sudden departure after less than a year was due to overexposure and a jealousy on the part of Australia's wider acting community. Even the newspapers declared as such, and I quote from The Critic, "Rumour goes that the much-boomed Douglas Gerrard returns at once to London. They set this sudden change of plan down to lack of appreciation on behalf of the Melbourne press. It points to one moral. Booming beforehand is fatal. Had nothing been heard of the young Irish actor and he worked into leading roles without trumpet flare and blast, the metropolis would have risen and proclaimed him a good artist and a pleasant figure on stage. As it was, people spoilt him beforehand and brought about a reaction in his disfavour. His photographs were too plentiful, and the interviewer made him a fop and a ranter, and he is neither. But the public does not change its mind easily, and that's how things are." Unquote. So, an altogether tell-it-as-it-is press there. Now, before he left Australia, Douglas took a number of weeks out to recuperate and rest, and this he did at McLeod Station in New South Wales. A station would be like a large holding of land, rather like a ranch in American terms. Now, while he was there, he got to know some of the locals quite well, and one of them persuaded him to invest in a local copper mine that said was going to come good one day. Now, he'd little to lose, so I imagine after his experience, why not? So he invested in the Budgery copper mine in the Cobar district. It proved to be an excellent decision, because those shares did come good, and not too long after either. His return valued at almost £20,000, a huge sum of money in 1906-1907.
By the way, I Googled the monetary value of £20,000 in 1905, and according to the website, quote, in 2013 dollars, this would be almost $600,000, a great investment to say the least. Douglas Gerrard left Australia under somewhat disappointing circumstances then, but he left a wealthy or wealthier man because of his copper mine investment. And I must mention that by that time he already had substantial experience in the theater, and he was barely 30 years old. This is something I want to point out because, as you told me, Liam, his birth date is often cited in error. I found this to be true, and for the record, you discovered he was born in 1879, and this made him 16 years older than Valentino. I also feel I should mention an article, which I will be citing quite a bit in this episode, an article on Gerrard you discovered in your research, And this is an incredible find, and one which I think contributes a great deal of groundbreaking material regarding the story of Gerrard and his friendship with Valentino. Now, this article is titled El Amigo Douglas Gerrard, or The Friend Douglas Gerrard, and was published in the February 1927 issue of the Spanish movie fan magazine Cine Mundial. It was written by the Spanish journalist Baltasar Fernandez Coué. Yes, Baltasar Coué being one and the same who authored the book The True Rudolph Valentino, a book Valentino was working on with Coué when he died, which you translated and published, Renato. I want to share just one line right now from this article, which I feel articulates a critical aspect about Gerrard as he travels to America, first New York and then Los Angeles. And I quote, "Douglas Gerrard is, without any doubt, one of the most prepared artists to ever come to Hollywood." End quote. I think this was certainly the case, as according to what you've told us, Liam, by the time he arrived in Hollywood, he had already experienced years of theatrical work. By 1913, we see Gerrard appearing in a play with Ethel Barrymore titled Lady Frederick in New York, and he seems to have landed in Hollywood shortly after to a very warm reception. So surely his fine reputation on the English, Irish, and Australian stage preceded him. He enters the world of cinema in 1913, and by 1915, he's working with some of the biggest stars of the day and rising quickly to impressive heights socially in Los Angeles. He becomes a favored Toastmaster and MC at very upscale social clubs in New York and Los Angeles, such as the Players Club in New York, the Savage Club in London, the Photo Players Club in Los Angeles, and of course the Los Angeles Athletic Club. And as one of his bios reads, and I quote, "Douglas Gerrard is one of the board of directors of the Photo Players Club, and his enviable reputation as a raconteur places him in the foremost ranks of the entertainment committees of all clubs." End quote. Now, Douglas Gerrard was extremely popular. Liam, can you comment on his personality and what you think made him so very popular and well-liked?
Well, quite simply, Douglas Gerrard was a charmer with the Irish work ethic. He had over a decade of experience in front of live audience, so he knew what worked and what did not. Now, having worked with some of the world's biggest names in theatre, he was able to bring their knowledge to the screen and use their methods in front of a camera, and it worked. I imagine he used this experience and gave suggestions and opinions to his directors, and that was noted by the studio bosses. I've no doubt that this is the reason he was given directorial duties after only 3 years. Now, as I mentioned, he was a charmer. He knew what to say and when to say it and who to say it to. But he was also not false. He was true to himself and he behaved impeccably whilst in company and was extremely well-mannered. He could talk and had what we Irish call the gift of the gab. Full of stories and anecdotes, he was brilliant company, and this is why he was invited to so many parties and he hosted so many numerous dinners himself. He was a very likeable guy. Everybody wanted to be around him because with Douglas Gerrard, you got a trustworthy, interesting and loyal friend, and people just liked his company.
And one of those people who apparently enjoyed his company was prima donna Anna Pavlova. You discovered, Liam, that they had a passionate love affair. This was also mentioned in the article The Friend Douglas Gerrard. I know Gerrard and Pavlova worked together on a movie. Is that correct?
Yes, indeed. They certainly did appear in a movie together from which a passionate love affair developed. All began on the set of The Dumb Girl of Portici, which was released in 1916. Now, for some time, the major studios had been trying to woo Miss Pavlova onto the screen because her fame as a dancer was worldwide. She was in such high demand and everybody wanted to see her. So Universal won the race to sign her, but her terms included the fact that she wanted to be paid $50,000 up front. It was a huge production, one of the most expensive ever produced at that time. The sets were elaborate, the costumes were amazing, the details on the set design, the sculptures, the jewellery, absolutely superb. The film was directed by Lois Weber, who had directed Douglas in his first movie appearance back in 1913, Suspense. She had also directed him in The Merchant of Venice and various other productions, but she was thought to be the best person to bring the best out of Miss Pavlova. Now, Lois was known for her use of elaborate camera shots and angles, and her moving cameras were amazing and pioneering for 1915. But sadly, this film has not aged well, and that's just my opinion. Now, it is worth watching, once perhaps, for the elegance that Anna Pavlova brings to the screen. She is graceful and powerful, and one can see that she definitely deserved her prima ballerina title. But as one reviewer wrote, she can dance, but she cannot act. Now, this was her first film role, and she only appeared on camera once more, many years later, in a movie called The Dying Swan. So was her experience that bad, or did the reviews simply leave her less than satisfied? Rumour from the set was that Lois Weber as director was so in awe of her and somewhat afraid of directing her that she merely allowed Anna Pavlova do as she pleased. Douglas Gerrard played the aristocrat who seduces her, and it is from this that their passionate love affair began. And testament to this lay in the numerous signed photographs that adorned the walls of Douglas's house, taking pride of place amongst his collection. And it was noted by friends and journalists alike that the inscriptions from Miss Pavlova to Douglas that sat upon these photographs were a firm testimony of their love affair by the language that she used. Now, the admiration continued after the movie wrapped production, as 2 years later Douglas accompanied Rudolph Valentino to a performance of the Russian ballet with Anna Pavlova. Now, at the end of the show, the audience were wondering who the well-dressed gent in the Valentino box was, who insisted on calling out so many bravos and Pavlovas. And then he proceeded to shower her stage with rose stem after rose stem. And they were left in no doubt it was Douglas Gerrard, as he then leapt from the box and onto the stage, where he knelt and kissed her hand. Now tell me they're not the actions of a man in love.
What an incredible story. And the dramatic leap onto the stage, I would say, is certainly testimony to Gerrard's athleticism. Now, Douglas Gerrard seems quite the ladies' man in Hollywood, as insight into this aspect of his personality is revealed in this excerpt from Coué's article, and I quote, "For Douglas Gerrard, his friends are sacred. Poor and rich, famous or unknown, they are all, from Jerry's point of view at least, a democracy, in which all are equal, including millionaires, directors, stars, and starlets. In the heart of Douglas Gerrard, humanity is divided mainly into two classes, friends and not friends. For the friends, everything. For the not friends, the right to become friends. Both classes are divided into two subclasses, women on the one hand, and on the other, men. It deserves mentioning that the manly Douglas Gerrard violates his democratic rules somewhat in granting preference to women. But in regards to women, it is rare for this Irish artist to lower his predilection. True, he has had casual as well as many unforgettable loves. You just need to look at the huge museum of images hung on the walls of his living room. Among the countless affectionate dedications of the most famous personalities from all over the world, there are some which confirm mutual passion. Foremost are the various portraits of Anna Pavlova, which are inscribed with firm strokes as testimony of her passionate love affair with Douglas Gerrard. As a rule, the Admirable Jerry is in love with the beautiful sex and bestows his love for an individual woman by considering her as the representative of all the beautiful sex. This representative, however, would change every day." End quote.
I really found that image in the article very, very interesting. Douglas Gerrard has something handwritten across the front of his shirt.
That's true, Renato, but I'm saving that moment to tell listeners what is written on the shirt for the ending.
Okay, so good.
So by 1917, Gerrard is acting and directing in major film vehicles and working for some of the biggest movie studios, Universal, Kalem, famous players Lasky. And this is when he meets Rudolph Valentino. And who better to tell us about that meeting than Douglas Gerrard himself? And I quote the San Francisco Examiner, December 3rd, 1922. "I met Rudolph Valentino. at the end of the year 1917, when he was then in Los Angeles. I sympathized with Valentino because he spoke very poor English, had difficulty in obtaining employment, and I suspected that at the time he was actually hungry. I took no other interest in him at the time. One day early in 1918, Valentino asked me to loan him $25, which I did out of sympathy and perhaps from the motive of economy, since I knew that if he did not repay me, he would not ask for more. Shortly thereafter, Valentino obtained a position and repaid me my loan from his first week's salary. And when sometime later he attempted to borrow from me a much larger sum, I made the loan willingly. This was also promptly returned. On a number of occasions, I made loans to Valentino and always found him to be scrupulous about making repayment as soon as he obtained employment. Mr. Valentino always lived quietly and economically and was most earnest about his work. Later, Mr. Valentino and I became close friends, and although he was unknown, I took an interest in him and introduced him to my friends. At 7 or 8 big parties hosted by me at the Los Angeles Athletic Club, where men and women were present, he made a distinctly favorable impression by courtesy and consideration to certain of the older ladies, mothers of young ladies present, while other young men of the party were dancing with and paying attention only to the young feminine guests. This was not from any motive whatsoever, except innate courtesy and kindliness." End quote. So Gerrard acts as sponsor, with one article referring to him as the, quote, appointed counselor, and loaning Valentino money, loaning him dress clothes, and inviting him to all sorts of high society galas, attended by all of Gerrard's influential friends in the motion picture industry. And for one more account of how Gerrard met Valentino, I have to read this excerpt from the true Rudolph Valentino, page 53. And I quote, "Douglas met Rudolph at Universal Studios. Rudolph had just debuted as an extra in the movie Alimony. Douglas was a director who had already discovered several artists who became famous: Patsy Ruth Miller, Ruth Clifford, and Monroe Salisbury. The actor Charles Gerrard introduced Rudolph to his brother Douglas by encouraging him to cast him in his next film. Then Norman Carey introduced Rudolph to Douglas on another occasion in a restaurant. It seems Norman and Charles wanted to expel the burden Rudolph presented." End quote. So, Liam, do you think Gerrard was concerned for Valentino because of his own experience in Australia? His being doomed there because he was too quickly overboomed? Why do you think Gerrard had this sort of sympathetic attitude for Valentino? Was this a sort of fatherly attitude, or did he recognize the potential in Valentino?
Well, I certainly think his Australian experiences would have left Douglas with a heightened sense of minding those around him, if you like. Keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. And he was also aware of the power of the press. Now, he himself used the marketing potential of the press to his own advantage to portray himself as a big figure in English acting circles, remember, when he was in Australia. But he also knew how the press could overplay a subject and how unforgiving they were. Now, couple these experiences with his own genuine character, and I think we certainly have a father figure who perhaps did not want to see someone as inexperienced and genuinely decent like Valentino get messed around. Now, Douglas was a leader, a manager perhaps, but certainly someone who understood the way Hollywood worked, and he took it upon himself to guide, shall we say, this young actor and to ensure that he was not taken advantage of or mismanaged. So to a certain extent, there is an argument that Douglas Gerrard was Rudolph Valentino's first manager. And yes, I certainly do think that Douglas saw the potential in Valentino. Now, Douglas was a director, and he knew that Valentino had something special. Douglas was very, very thorough in his work, and he'd spend hours scouting for locations and making sure he had the right actor or actress to go with whatever role he needed to fill. Now, he also nurtured talent and was credited with discovering a couple of actors and actresses at that time. So much so that the press even saw fit to write about it. So if we bring all these elements together, it does show that Valentino probably owed a lot more to Douglas Gerrard than has been previously thought.
Yes, I completely agree. As our listeners are well aware, a great deal of our Valentino research exposes a studio-generated censorship of Valentino's life story, which resulted in a rather fictionalized version. This is why Valentino began work with Coué on a true story in the months before his death. And I think there was a downplaying of Gerrard's true contribution, which has been by and large eliminated in this studio version of the story. Yes, we see the familiar images, Gerrard and Valentino engaged in a great deal of fun and camaraderie, such as that infamous video clip of them sparring with Douglas feigning a black eye. There's a great deal of horsing around and mugging for cameras. They ride horseback, and Gerrard appears as just another member of Valentino's inner circle of close friends. But we learn that much more was going on professionally. And when Rudolph fell in love with Natasha Rambova, it's apparent she and Jerry became close friends also, I add, for a while. There are rumors that Gerrard, being energetic and tremendously social, could have been banished by Natasha. This because he and Rudy's other single friends would take him out for nights of partying, bootleg wine, whiskey, and women until dawn. For Natasha, this was a bit too much horsing around. And in Balthasar Coué's The True Rudolph Valentino, Coué directly accuses Natasha of banishing Gerrard. In writing about Gerrard's role in Valentino's life, Coué writes on page 53, and I quote, "In his autobiography, Rudolph recounts this first stage of his career in Cinelandia. Yet the reader who is familiar with his actual life cannot help but think he commits a great injustice in that story by omitting the name of someone who, without any doubt, was his best friend at the time. An explanation of such injustice comes to my mind. The famous autobiography was written under the influence of Natasha Rambova, who convinced Rudolph to distance himself from his friend." End quote.
But Gerrard was a witness at their first wedding in Mexico, wasn't he?
He was, Renato, and this, as I mentioned earlier in the episode, resulted in disaster for Rudolph and Natasha. As his divorce from his first wife, Jean Acker, was not final by the time he married Natasha in May of 1922, he was charged with bigamy and thrown in jail for a night while his friends raised bail. There's a great image of Valentino with Douglas Gerrard and screenplay writer June Mathis outside the jail upon his release. I think it is here we see Gerrard in his managerial role for Valentino. And I add it was in great measure due to Douglas Gerrard's testimony that the charges against Rudy were dismissed. And hence we arrive at our starting point in this story. Valentino's exodus to the woods of upstate New York and Foxlair with Jerry, and the onset of his strike against famous players Lasky. We gain further insight into Jerry's relationship with Natasha at this time and his involvement in the management of their lives by reading excerpts of 2 letters included in The True Rudolph Valentino, and I add Valentino gave these letters to Coué to include in the book. Now, these letters were written by Natasha to Jerry during her first days of exile at Foxlair, and emotions were obviously running high. Now, the phone call she refers to was the call from their attorney, W.I. Gilbert, or G, informing Rudy he was about to be charged with bigamy, and I quote, Natasha writes, "Dear Jerry, you say in your telegram that you cannot understand my point of view. This proves that you do not understand me in any way, because otherwise you would not have sent me such a message. He was not the only one who suffered hysterical attacks because of that phone call. It seems that you two believe that I have nothing to do but distrust him and believe that he's out there with other women. Well, the truth is that I do not even think about that anymore. 1 woman or 100, it does not matter anymore. I do not care. If you could try to understand instead of jumping to conclusion." She ends this letter with, "If you do not understand this, it's just too bad. I'm too tired to try to explain myself better. If you were not such a good friend, I would not care what you think. But I will still love you anyway, for what you have done for Rudy, even though you have made me suffer more than you can imagine." Her second letter begins, "Dear Jerry, thank you very much for your more than appreciated letter. which came to me last night. Of course, you had a lot of reasons to be angry when you received my letter. As for me, Jerry, please do me the favor of believing that I fully trust you, and that I know you have been my best friend, as well as Rudolph's, and that you are helping us in everything so that we can see each other again. She goes on, after the stupid advice that G gave us before, it is natural that his opinion does not inspire much confidence now that everyone advises me otherwise. G is a good lawyer, but he does not realize how much the public opinion and the press opinion matter to Rudy. Perhaps the best thing I could do is to go abroad with my mother and convince Rudy to make his next film in Europe. She closes the letter with all my love for my dear and loyal friend Jerry, signed Natasha, end quote. So Gerrard is clearly in a managerial role, as Natasha writes about his negotiating with the attorney Gilbert, and she directly refers to his advising Rudy. Liam, what do you think prompted Douglas Gerrard to accompany Rudolph Valentino to Foxlair? Gerrard's career was at such a high point then. Do you think he knew what would happen to him as a result?
Well, when Valentino returned home alone after Natasha left for Foxlair, his friends rallied around him and obviously tried to take his mind off what had happened and tried to keep him busy. We know the charges of bigamy were eventually dismissed, due in part to Douglas's testimony, and we also know that Valentino had to film The Young Raja. Now, Douglas himself had filmed Impulse and also A Tailor-Made Man earlier that year, 1922, and he would not begin production on his next movie, Omar the Tent Maker, until the beginning of October, so he had a number of months free time. Now, we know that Rudy was obviously not the happiest at this time in his life, and I believe his personality during the shooting of The Young Raja was one of grumpiness, and he grumbled throughout the shoot. Now, at the time, Douglas obviously realised that no amount of work, taking his mind off things, keeping him distracted, etc. would help, and I would be of the opinion that Douglas knew the only way to help was to get Rudy and Natasha together. Now, knowing his personality and extroverted nature, I would attest that Douglas came up with the plan to get Rudy to New York and escape the press. They were both actors, and a couple of disguises in the form of false beards and glasses may well work, and work they did. Now, Douglas, in a way, seems to have taken charge and told his faithful friend Rudy that this is what they're going to do, and I'm sure Rudy had no objection. Now, did Douglas know what consequences this would have for him as a result? No, I don't think so. If he did, would he have still done what he did? Yes, I believe he would have. He would not have known he would be involved in shooting a studio detective. As far as he was concerned, I reckon, he had time off, and he used it to help his very good friend and cheer him up. Simple.
Well, as we have implied from the beginning of this episode, indeed, subsequent to the shooting at Foxlair and the onset of Valentino's strike, we see an immediate downgrade, if not disappearance, in the roles and jobs Gerrard then received in Hollywood. I know you noticed this, Liam, and that the name Gerrard was not so top billing after the shooting.
No, sadly, Douglas was not top billing afterwards, and his name dropped down the pecking order quite a bit. And not only that, he was assigned to less important parts, and as a result, less screen time. In fact, he appears to have been assigned to the extras pot, if you like. Now, the following year, 1923, Douglas was not involved in a single movie at all and appears to have been dropped and shunned completely. Sadly, he would never again regain the success he had achieved in the years prior to 1922, although he did work right up to his death in 1950, but sadly was largely uncredited in the 31 movies he appeared in over the last 20 years of his life.
The shooting at Foxlair was reported on extensively, yes, and due to the timing of this, it became synonymous with the details of Valentino's legal filing against famous players. The two events were not unique from each other, and this was not good news for Douglas Gerrard. I think tangible evidence of Gerrard's immediate demise is found in a letter written by Rudy to Gerrard in the spring of 1923, which he gave to Baltasar Coué to include in the True Rudolph Valentino. I quote from page 92. Rudy writes, "Frankly speaking, if I was in your place, I would have remained neutral, instead of favoring one side or the other. You say I was wrong in judging M. I wish it were so. But as you know, I've known him for a long time, and I know very well what I'm saying. I think I've devoted too much time to an issue as uninteresting as this one, so I'll put a period on it and move on to something else. I'm really glad you came back to California, and I hope that when this letter reaches your hands, I will find you very busy in the direction of a film. By the way, I saw Dick Rowland in Chicago, and he told me that he did not understand how he's not seen you again. After having told you that his company did not like the kind of plot line you had chosen, he also told me that if you're going to see him again, he would find you a scenario and give you a chance with First National. He told me he would have given you the opportunity with First National, not because of Rex's recommendation, but by June's recommendation and by mine. My tour progresses very satisfactorily, and I have no more than 9 weeks because I have no interest in committing myself for a long period of time, given that the Paramount issue can be resolved at any time, end quote. So here we have it. Valentino to me sounds apologetic, and within a few months of the Foxlair incident. Liam, your thoughts on this admission by Valentino that he was trying to line up work for Douglas Gerrard?
Yes, that is an interesting piece of correspondence, all right, isn't it? Well, it's interesting that he begins the letter by speaking frankly, and by admitting that if the tables were turned, he, Rudy, would have remained neutral. I wonder why he felt the need to say that. Then he goes on to assert himself somewhat, and in a way take control by telling his friend, "Look, I understand what you are saying, but I don't agree with you that I was wrong in judging M." He then goes on to say, "It's taken up too much of my time, it's uninteresting, and I've drawn a line under it." Now that all speaks volumes that enough is enough, this is over. But the fact he is quite assertive is interesting, quite like, "Look, I'm able to look after myself now, I don't need you telling me what to do or your guidance, okay?" But then he goes on to say, "I'm really glad that Douglas has come back to California. I hope you'll be back in charge of a production by the time the letter reaches you." He mentions Dick Rowland, First National, Rex Ingram, June Mathis, all with regard to getting work for him. And he mentions his recommending him for work. Now, did Rudy feel somewhat responsible for the circumstances his friend was now in? Possibly he did. Possibly he felt he needed to keep Douglas Gerrard's name current, the need to perhaps fix some of the hurt he had been the cause of. Now, Rudy doesn't come out and say this straight, but he does appear to be offering a helping hand to his old friend.
He does, Liam, and this offer of a helping hand seems, in my opinion, evidence of an immediate fall from grace, a boycott even. This said, we do find some evidence Jerry is still acting as a spokesman for Valentino in May of 1923 in a syndicated article titled, "Has Valentino Made Peace with Enemies?" Here Gerrard gives the press a statement how Valentino has received some offers in regards to the settlement of the strike. Now we have to wonder who put the word out to boycott all things Douglas Gerrard. Was it Natasha fearing another telling of the shooting in the press? Was it Jesse Lasky and the powers that were at Famous Players Lasky, or all of the above? And it is not until after Rudy and Natasha's separation in August of 1925, some 3 years, almost to the day, from the shooting at Foxlair, that we find evidence Jerry has reunited with his pal Rudolph Valentino and is a regular at Falcon Lair. Now, in this great article, The Friend Douglas Gerrard, there's an account of the moment when Rudy told Jerry about his separation from Natasha, including his relating to him how the separation was due to an affair Natasha had with a cameraman, and I quote, "It was on one of those rare occasions when Jerry was alone, when his great friend Rudolph Valentino sadly arrived at the Bohemian oasis. Douglas was unusually concerned when he saw his friend's unhappy face. Without preamble, Valentino said gravely, 'Jerry, I just separated from Natasha.' In response, Jerry removed his monocle in a comic gesture and gave a thunderous laugh which shook the walls of the building. He continued his rowdy commentary until the smile returned to Rudolph's face. In his own way, Jerry did his friend a favor. Incidentally, he also expounded on his ideas about marriage. He then listened in silence to the as yet undisclosed cause for the famous separation. While Rudolph was sharing this with his close friend, The mere dozen of bitter words utterly humiliated the conqueror of the screen. As soon as Rudy finished the brief confidence, Douglas Gerrard stood up solemnly, walked to one of the walls covered with portraits, and violently tore up the 2 photographs of Natasha Rambova which she dedicated to him." End quote. I think it is also worth noting that in the summer of 1923, as work dried up for Douglas Gerrard, Valentino hired George Ullman as manager. Now, did this also herald further distancing of Gerrard in his managerial role? And in regards to Ullman's appearance, I add the following side note here. We know from Ullman's memoir that during the filming of Monsieur Beaucaire in 1924, Valentino learned his co-star Doris Kenyon was out of a contract. He asked George Ullman to negotiate one for her, which he did. Why did he not do so for Jerry? And while Valentino was filming his last 2 movies with famous players Lasky, Monsieur Beaucaire, and Sainted Devil, Gerrard is appearing in 2 real shorts. It makes one wonder why, when Valentino was then in complete control over his films with Ritz-Carlton Pictures, why did he not hand Gerrard a role, some position in the cast or production? I think this is indicative that Natasha was then instigating the banishment of Gerrard, or, in the least, participating in it. But by August of 1926, Valentino dies suddenly, and we see Doug Gerrard as a pallbearer at the Los Angeles funeral. And we learn from Baltasar Coué that Gerrard is eager to meet with him to contribute to the book Valentino was working on. This resulted in so many new great anecdotes, which only Douglas Gerrard could relate. The great story how Jerry and Rudolph competed for the love of Mary Miles Minter. The story of the conversation between Charlie Chaplin, Rudolph Valentino, Douglas Gerrard, and John Gilbert, as Gilbert contemplates suicide. Those stories are well worth reading, so entertaining and valuable historically, in my opinion. And it is by 1926 we find Gerrard making a comeback with Warner Brothers. Liam, I know you found it heartening that Douglas Gerrard still seemed to have his spirit despite the years of boycotting.
Knowing what I know about Douglas Gerrard, I would doubt he ever lost his spirit at any time in his life. Well, he needed to put food on the table and pay bills, and so as such he needed to work. But indeed, it would have been very easy for him to give up and call a halt to his movie career, considering all that had happened to him. His fall from the top of the tree, his diminishing offers of parts, and his name not being what it once was. Others would certainly have given up, but not Douglas Gerrard. Now, he could have returned to Ireland. His family were well off, if you like, and he always had the theatre to return to, even in a managerial role. But whatever about his personality, he had an Irish spirit and an Irish resolve that he didn't, and I'll use an Irish saying here, he didn't lick it off the stones. Personally, he had a lineage back to Dermot MacMurrough, a king who was dethroned, but against all odds fought back to regain that throne and rule once more when he could easily have given up. Douglas's Australian experiences, where he virtually overnight fell from grace, but again he picked himself up, dusted himself off and carried on. And on a wider scale, he had the Irish resolve. The Irish have had a tough road through history. Our numerous fights and battles for independence, our famine, our hardships, our economic failures, right up to recently where we saw possibly one of the worst economic falls in the Western world. And we needed bailing out. But we took our fate, we took our medicine and we rode it out. And Irish people do that. But we do it in a way that make the rest of the world marvel at us. We do it with spirit, with good humour, and with a will to show that we can get back to the heights we once achieved. Douglas had all of this and more. He had a personality that showed a spirit of achievement, and he had a pick up, dust yourself off and get on with it attitude as well.
Now, the article I have been citing, this was part of Douglas's comeback. It's a great promotional piece and basically an advertisement for him written by Baltasar Coué. It really provides many great stories which reveal exactly what you are speaking about, Liam, his great perseverance.
One of those great stories is how Gerrard went to the estate auction to see some of his own suits for sale as Valentino's.
Renato, that's such a quizzical story. Yes, some of the suits Douglas Gerrard loaned Valentino many years prior ended up for sale in those auctions. Now, there's one theme which we see throughout Gerrard's life. which we have yet to mention, which I feel significant. And this would be his many accidents. And there were many. Liam, do you think he was accident prone? And he died in such a way, did he not?
Poor old Douglas. He was a little bit accident prone, I think. Even going back to early days on the English theatre. He, one night whilst playing in Henry V, was so engrossed in his performance, he didn't notice that the scenery had come loose. It fell on him and injured him quite badly, so he had to be taken off the bill for a number of nights while he got better. And then when he went to Australia during his Australian trip, he had a bad reaction to a bee sting and nearly caused the show to be cancelled that night. But the trooper that he was, he went on and gave a fantastic performance. Again in Australia, whilst on his rest and recuperation up in New South Wales, he was gored by a bull and sustained 3 broken ribs. In 1918 in Hollywood, he caught the Spanish flu. Now this was a flu that went on to kill 5 million people. He recovered, but he was laid up for 2 weeks and was quite ill at that time because of it. Again out in Hollywood, he was out scouting for locations at one time, and he lost his footing and fell at the edge of a cliff, and if it wasn't for a little sapling, he would have actually died. He'd have fallen quite a substantial way. Now, on another occasion, he was knocked off his bike by a truck and sustained 4 broken ribs. He went to hospital, but he was released more or less straight away. He was just some trooper. Given the fact that this was a guy who would have had probably more mishaps, because he had a lifestyle of athleticism such as boxing, highboard diving and skiing. So it's a wonder he didn't actually have much more accidents. And then his death, sadly, there was an inquiry over his death because he sustained a head injury and the police weren't sure if he'd been killed or not. But as it happened, he'd had a heart attack, and as he fell, he managed to smack his head off something, and that was what that was. Now, on another occasion, maybe this wasn't an accident as such, but it could have been. Whilst filming on the set of Conscience, there was a scene where himself and Gladys Brockwell get married, but the actor who was to play the minister didn't show up that day, so the assistant director was sent off to get a replacement. When he returned, the guy he returned with had all the ministerial garb on and looked the part, so the director started to shoot the scene. But halfway through shooting the scene, the director was a bit suspicious, so he stopped shooting, and it turned out that the replacement actor was in fact a real minister, and he thought he was there to perform an actual marriage. So Douglas Gerrard and Gladys Brockwell were minutes away from being Mr. and Mrs.
I know there are few other stories of his narrow escapes while filming. One account where hounds chased him up a tree, and another where he saved a trainer from a lion who was not obeying his commands and was about to attack. Doug Gerrard was such a colorful member of the Irish community and the motion picture industry at the time. And as this is your field of expertise and research, can you address this Irish influence in Hollywood at the time and some of the more notable players?
Yes, indeed, and as you will see when our book Shillelagh Slapstick is published, the Irish community in early Hollywood was quite amazing. There were numerous Irish-born actors who made up the bit players and supporting staff in those early movies. But there were other actors, names like Douglas Gerrard, Kate Price, James Kelly, Paddy Maguire, Creighton Hale and Rex Ingram, all huge names at the time. But not only that, there were the children and grandchildren of the Irish immigrants, who were also very proud of their Irish heritage. Mary Pickford, for example, spent years tracing her roots in the old country. Peggy O'Neill, Molly O'Day, Max Sennett and Hal Roach, 2 pioneering studio owners who were very proud of their Irish heritage and boasted about it. And you can see the Irish sense of humour and fun in so many of their movies. There were the Moore brothers, Patsy O'Leary, Eileen Percy, Amelia Somerville, Lumsden Hare, Forrester Harvey, and of course William Desmond Taylor, who of course has his own story. But here I want to mention William Mulholland, he of Mulholland Drive in Los Angeles. He was born in Belfast in 1855, and he is responsible for building the infrastructure to provide a water supply that allowed Los Angeles grow into the city that it is today. Would we have even had a Hollywood without him?
Excellent point, Liam. And Mulholland certainly is a name attached to a great deal of Los Angeles history. The landmark Mulholland Drive is one of the most scenic drives, great views. Another Los Angeles landmark, which our listeners might not know about, would be the final resting place of Douglas Gerrard. Liam, I know you have located Jerry's grave.
Yes, indeed. We managed to find Douglas Gerrard's grave, and sadly he lies in an unmarked plot in Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, Los Angeles. He died on the 5th of June 1950, aged 70 years. Now, thankfully, we have begun proceedings to have a marker placed on the grave because, well, he deserves better than that. Now, contrary to some reports, he never married and he had no children. His parents and siblings are all buried together in a large grave in Dublin. And sadly, not one of those siblings had any children either. So the trail runs cold here and ends. Now, his sister, Mary Claire, was the last of the family to die in 1979. And she had Douglas's name put onto that grave in Dublin. So the family are all mentioned, and up to a point, they're all together there.
I have to say that it's been most entertaining to read about Douglas Gerrard, and many articles definitely reveal an affection for him, such as one article where they say that he could argue the leg off an iron pot. And I want to add, as someone who has researched the many accounts of those who knew Valentino and wrote about their affiliations with him after his death, Douglas Gerrard never told unseemly stories, never told wild tales, and kept his memories respectful, unlike Robert Flory and Paul Ivanhoe, to name two, who really did not do themselves any favors in their not-so-flattering reminiscences of Valentino. I also think it's significant that Valentino gave those particular letters to Balthasar Coué. Was there something he wanted Coué to address and remedy? I think so, and perhaps we have helped that along here today with you, Liam. I want to close with one last excerpt from the Coué article, El Amigo Douglas Gerrard, and I quote, "Fortunately, Douglas Gerrard is exceptionally strong, muscular, and in good health. Therefore, he can withstand this lifestyle, which forces him to find reasons for enjoyment, at least every day. In Jerry's case, this requires an immense investment of energy, because he is not one of those people who are satisfied only with the bagatelle and one partner. Jerry is, first of all, the chief general of the spree, the soul of the meeting, he who is always in the midst of everything, he who animates the party if it falters, and inspires a further boost when it is already animated. He is the one who brings harmony to couples in any case of their disagreement, and he who stimulates them when they progress a bit too calmly." End quote.
So you did not reveal what was written on Gerrard's shirt in the image for the article.
Renato, I did not. It's not terribly easy to read, but it says, "Beware, keep your nose out of our business." So was this the great lesson, a warning to the press in the studios? A lesson Doug Gerrard learned from the shooting at Foxlair? Perhaps his shirt holds the answer. So Liam, in closing today, do you have any further comments to share on Douglas Gerrard's legacy?
Well, when I began my research into Douglas Gerrard, I initially found him as the brother of Charles K. Gerrard, who I knew from a particular Laurel and Hardy film. Now, having never heard of Douglas, I assumed I was going to have very little to write about, and assumed he might just be an addition at the back of the book. But as I began to unravel his story, I got more and more excited, as my daily messages to my colleague Stephen will attest to. I never expected to find the son of a Dublin city marshal who ascended to the top of Shakespearean acting circles, under the stewardship of some of the biggest names in that world. Not only that, but a one-time superstar down under who realised £20,000 from a small investment. He befriended two of the most important characters in literary and acting circles, James Joyce and Rudolph Valentino. Douglas Gerrard's films are not the blockbusting marvels that we know today. They won't be his legacy. His legacy won't be the friendships he made, the company he kept, or the lavish dinners he gave. His legacy will be his resolve, his never-ending resolve to carry on with a stiff upper lip, chin held high, and best foot forward. But not only that, but to do it with a smile and a nod and a wink. I have felt enormous pressure to do him justice in retelling his story and in telling the world how much of an amazing man he was. And I think we have gone some way towards doing that.
I certainly think you have, Liam, and you've added to the Valentino history considerably in doing so. I want to thank you for your time and your most generous assistance in putting this episode together. And thank you for allowing me to read some of you and your co-author Stephen O'Crowley's manuscript. Well done. And I know we are now all eagerly awaiting Shillelagh Slapstick. I hope when it's published you'll come back to tell us more about the book. And I want to point our listeners in the direction of your book, currently on Amazon, titled Near Dublin, The Story of Laurel and Hardy in Ireland, the story of their visit to Ireland in the 1950s. So thank you, Liam, and please keep in touch.
Ciao, Liam.
Well, firstly, I want to say thank you to you both for allowing me input into this podcast, and also for your enthusiasm in doing so. As I found out the further I delved into this extraordinary man's life, his was a story that needed to be told. His influence and guidance aided so many people, and his flamboyant personality and flair, coupled with his resolve to carry on, is something that should be taught in schools. What next? Douglas Gerrard the movie? Evelyn and Renato, my thanks, my friendship, and an old Irish blessing. May the road rise to meet you, or as we say, Os Gaeilge in Irish, Gunairi on Boherlath.
Thank you, Liam. Thank you so much. In closing, I want to mention Renato and I have put together a video of images of Douglas Gerrard to accompany this episode, and the link to that video is found in the caption of this episode, so check that out. I hope this episode has brought the fabulous friend and the admirable Douglas Gerrard to life, and it inspired further interest in his life and work. I know it sure has for me. And what happened to that wounded spy? As the story goes, it was reported a man was seen boarding the local train the morning following the shooting, and he was limping badly, walking with a cane. Perhaps he was just very, very lucky. And again, I want to remind our listeners that all of our books, as well as Liam Muldowney's book, Near Dublin, are available on Amazon and all online book-selling venues. We have also been recording my reading Affairs Valentino, and those videos are now available on our YouTube channel, which can also be linked to through the episode's caption.
And for today, as the usual, I say Fiat Justitia, Ruat Celum. And for Liam and the good guys, arrivederci.